The aircraft lifted from the runway at Kalamata just past midnight on the 14th of December 1967. On board were a king, a queen, their two infant children, a queen mother, and a small retinue of officials who had spent the previous several hours watching a counter-coup dissolve. Constantine II of Greece was 27 years old. He had been king for 3 years. He had spent that final day broadcasting appeals by radio to military commanders across the country, asking them to stand against the junta that had seized Greece 8 months earlier. Very few answered the call. The decision to leave was made in the space of a few hours. Hastily packed luggage, a drive south through the dark to the airfield, a departure before Athens was entirely certain what had happened. The aircraft put down in Rome before the following day was out. It was not a planned destination, just the first one available. A king without a country had to find somewhere to be, and the search for that somewhere would shape the rest of his life. What he had left behind was not simply a throne. It was a dynasty over a century in the making, a country still working out who had the right to govern it and under what terms, and a set of questions about the 1960s that the flight from Kalamata had not answered, and that would take decades more to even partially resolve. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. To understand what Constantine had lost that night, it helps to begin with something that surprises many people the first time they encounter the Greek royal family. The Greek monarchy was not old. It was not even particularly Greek. The House of Glücksburg, which held the Greek throne for most of the 19th and 20th centuries, came originally from Denmark. King George I, the dynasty's founder, was a 17-year-old Danish prince named Wilhelm when the Greek National Assembly invited him to take the crown in 1863. Britain, France, and Russia had agreed on him when they could agree on nothing else. He accepted, learned the language, and reigned for 50 years. He was assassinated in Thessaloniki in 1913, shot by a man who gave no clearer reason for the act than personal conviction. The dynasty George I established proved more durably embedded in its adopted country than the circumstances of its founding might have suggested. His successors grew up speaking Greek, worshipped in the Orthodox faith, and navigated political crises that would have finished most institutions sooner. Greece in the first half of the 20th century endured the collapse of the Ottoman Empire and the territorial struggles that followed. A catastrophic military defeat in Asia Minor in 1922 that displaced over 1 million ethnic Greeks from ancestral territory, a German and Axis occupation during the Second World War, and a civil war from 1946 to 1949 that split the country along lines that were still raw when the 1960s arrived. The dynasty survived all of it, never without cost and never without controversy. The early decades of the dynasty were themselves unstable enough to establish a recurring pattern. Constantine I, the founder's eldest son, reigned through the First World War and the Asia Minor campaign and became a permanent figure of political controversy, blamed across a broad spectrum for decisions that had cost Greece territory and lives. His second son, Alexander, who succeeded briefly, died in 1920 from an infection contracted after a monkey bite, one of the stranger footnotes in European dynastic history. George II reigned twice, separated by a period of republican governance. The monarchy was abolished by referendum in 1924 and restored in 1935. The rhythm of departure and return, of exile and restoration, was woven into the family's institutional memory before Constantine II was born. The Greek public's ambivalence about the monarchy was not simply a political abstraction. It was a lived experience shaped by the choices kings had made in moments of national crisis, and by the consistent association of the palace with the political right in a country where the Civil War had made that alignment carry real weight. For a significant portion of the Greek population, the monarchy was not a neutral institution standing above politics. It was a participant in them, and what happened in the 1960s would confirm that perception beyond any institution's ability to argue against it afterward. King Paul I, Constantine's father, died in March of 1964 after 18 years on the throne. He left behind a country that had rebuilt from the wreckage of occupation and civil war, had joined NATO, and was posting some of the strongest economic growth figures in Europe at that time. He also left behind a political situation considerably more fragile than the surface numbers suggested. His wife, Queen Frederica, had been throughout his reign a figure of enormous energy and sustained controversy. She was German by origin, from the House of Hanover, came to Greece as a young woman, learned the language, and involved herself in the affairs of the state with a forcefulness that Greek politicians across the spectrum consistently found objectionable. The arguments that attached to her name did not die when her husband did. Constantine II became king at 23. He had grown up inside the disciplined world of dynastic life, with formal education, orthodox observance, and military training alongside the protocols of the palace. He was also, genuinely, an athlete. At the Rome Olympics in 1960, he won a gold medal in the Dragon-class sailing competition, a result that gave him a popularity that ceremony alone could not have produced. He married Princess Anne-Marie of Denmark in September of 1964. She was 18, the younger sister of Princess Margrethe, who would become Queen Margrethe II of Denmark when their father Frederick IX died in 1972. Their first child, Princess Alexia, was born in July of 1965. Their second, Crown Prince Pavlos, was born in May of 1967, 5 weeks after the country he was born heir to was seized by a military coup. The crisis that ended the monarchy had its roots in the political conflicts of the mid-1960s. In the summer of 1965, Constantine dismissed Prime Minister George Papandreou following a dispute over the defense ministry. The dismissal set off months of political instability, repeated changes of government, and a hardening polarization between the political left and a palace-connected right that could not sustain a parliamentary majority. The period became known as the apostasia, and it shadowed Constantine's reign from that point forward. Elections were scheduled for May of 1967. They never took place. The Greece of those years was carrying the weight of its recent history in ways that made the political atmosphere more combustible than the economic recovery figures suggested. The Civil War had ended less than 20 years before. Those who had fought on the losing side remained subject to surveillance and formal exclusion from much of Greek public life, under a security apparatus that had outlasted the conflict that created it. The political right was fractured between those committed to constitutional governance and those who regarded parliamentary politics as a permanent danger to the order they had fought to establish. The palace was not neutral in these divisions, and its lack of neutrality was part of what made the apostasia so damaging to the monarchy's long-term standing. On the 21st of April 1967, a group of middle-ranking army officers moved in the early morning hours. They occupied key installations in Athens, arrested politicians and military figures considered threats, took control of state broadcasting, and had the coup effectively complete before most of the country was awake. The leaders were Brigadier Stylianos Patakos, Colonel George Papadopoulos, and Colonel Nikolaos Makarezos. Constantine's response to the coup was the decision his critics would hold against him for the rest of his life. He swore in the junta's chosen prime minister. His supporters argued he had no real alternative, that armed resistance would have meant civilian casualties and a worse outcome, that he was biding his time. His critics argued that the act of compliance was itself the defining fact, and that everything that followed was its consequence. For 8 months, the king remained on the throne while the junta governed the country. On the 13th of December 1967, he decided to act. He issued broadcasts calling on military commanders to stand against the regime, announced that the legitimate government was relocating to Kavala in northern Greece, and flew north with loyalist officers to direct what he expected would become a widespread counter-coup. The response was not what he had expected. Some commanders were unwilling, others were unable. By nightfall, the counter-coup had produced no significant military mobilization outside Kavala, and the junta's actual grip on the armed forces had proven stronger than anyone loyal to Constantine had calculated. By early the following morning, it was over. The family gathered at the airfield at Kalamata. The aircraft lifted before dawn. In Rome, the Italian government received them. The family moved on to London and settled in a large house in Hampstead, the North London neighborhood that had, over many decades, absorbed more than one generation of European royalty with nowhere else to go. Constantine maintained contacts with Greek politicians in exile, continued to use the title of king, and watched events in Greece with the particular attention of someone who had a direct stake in how they turned out. Anne-Marie gave birth to their third child, Prince Nikolaos, in London in October of 1969, 2 years after the flight from Kalamata. Princess Theodora followed in 1983, and Prince Philippos in 1986, both born in London. The 3 youngest members of the family had England as their only home. In Greece, the junta's record deteriorated year by year. The government imposed censorship, arrested dissidents, and maintained its position through a combination of surveillance and violence that earned sustained international criticism. In November of 1973, students at the Athens Polytechnic occupied their building in protest against the regime. The junta sent tanks, The images of armored vehicles at the Polytechnic gates circulated internationally and destroyed whatever credibility the regime had retained with anyone prepared to give it the benefit of the doubt. By the summer of 1974, the colonels had engineered a catastrophe in Cyprus. They had backed a coup against Archbishop Makarios, the island's president, apparently calculating that the resulting chaos might produce a union of Cyprus with Greece that would shore up their domestic standing. The coup triggered a Turkish military invasion, the partition of Cyprus into the zones that still exist today, and the immediate collapse of the junta. Konstantinos Karamanlis, who had governed Greece effectively in the late 1950s and early 1960s before his own years of Parisian exile, was summoned back to lead a transitional government. The regime's 7 years in power had left the country's political culture in a condition of sustained wariness about concentrations of authority. A population that had just lived through dictatorship was not inclined to restore an institution whose relationship to the coup of April 1967 remained, at the very least, deeply complicated. When the referendum came, that wariness was part of what the 69% were expressing. Constantine, watching from London, had reason to think the regime's fall might change his own position. What came next was a referendum. On the 8th of December 1974, Greek voters were asked to choose between monarchy and republic. Constantine could not set foot in the country he was asking people to restore him to. He could address Greeks through broadcasts and through intermediaries, but the image of a king making his case from a house in North London was not a compelling political performance, and the campaign was conducted under conditions widely criticized as unfair to the monarchist side. The result came the following day. 69% of Greek voters chose the republic. The margin is the first thing to understand about what followed. This was not a narrow defeat in a closely divided country. 69% is a verdict, and it came from a population that had just lived through 8 years of military dictatorship, whose origins ran through the constitutional conflicts of the 1960s. Whether that result was entirely fair to Constantine personally is a separate question from whether it was decisive. It was decisive. His sister Sofia had married Prince Juan Carlos of Spain in 1962, 2 years before Constantine's own marriage. When Juan Carlos became King of Spain in November of 1975, the year after the Greek referendum, Constantine attended the coronation as a brother-in-law, present in the country next door, at an event that was the near-exact mirror of what he had been denied at home. Sofia became Queen of Spain. Their son Felipe eventually became King Felipe VI. Constantine was the uncle of a reigning Spanish king, the brother-in-law of a Spanish queen, and the former head of a monarchy that his own country had voted away in the same year Spain restored its own. Anne-Marie's older sister Margrethe had become Queen of Denmark in 1972 on the death of their father Frederick IX. Anne-Marie was therefore the sister of a reigning queen, as well as the wife of a former king, a position that required a particular steadiness, which she maintained, by all available evidence, for the rest of her life. The years immediately following the referendum were years of political consolidation for the Greek Republic, rather than constitutional revisiting. Karamanlis founded and led New Democracy, the center-right party that governed for most of the late 1970s. The Greek Constitution of 1975 formally established the Republic. When PASOK won the 1981 elections and Andreas Papandreou became prime minister, the left governed Greece for the first time in its modern history. The monarchy had no place in that story, and the governments that followed had no incentive to manufacture one for it. The post-referendum exile that Constantine now inhabited was different in character from the one that had preceded it. Before December of 1974, waiting had a plausible structure to it. After the vote, waiting had no particular destination. He remained in London, the household maintained, the children in English schools, the social world of European royalty accessible through the connections that blood and marriage had built, but none of it equivalent to the position that had been taken away. The Greek governments of the late 1970s and 1980s were varied in their attitudes toward the exiled family, but none of them had any interest in reopening the constitutional settlement. When Andreas Papandreou's socialist government came to power in 1981, the dynamic shifted to something colder still. Andreas was the son of George Papandreou, the same prime minister whose dismissal by Constantine in 1965 had triggered the apostasia. The personal history between the two families was not a simplifying factor. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. Through the older Greek dynastic network, Constantine had a significant family connection to Britain that gave the exile a different texture than simple displacement. His father Paul I and Prince Philip of Edinburgh had been first cousins, both grandsons of King George I of Greece through different sons. Philip's father, Prince Andrew of Greece and Denmark, was one of George I's sons. Paul I's father, Constantine I, was another. That made Paul I and Philip first cousins, and Constantine II and Philip first cousins once removed. The connection functioned in practice as family rather than merely genealogy. Philip had himself been born in Greece, at Monarchy on Corfu in 1921, and had spent his own life navigating the particular intersection of Glücksburg family history and British royal identity. He was a consistent presence in Constantine's world across the decades of exile, a cousin who understood from his own experience what it meant to hold a Greek name while living out a life formed somewhere else entirely. Monarchy, the neoclassical villa on Corfu from which the Greek royal estate had derived part of its historical weight, was among the properties the Greek state would later confiscate from Constantine. After the legal disputes were resolved, the government opened the villa as a museum about Corfu's history, with the room where Philip was born available to visitors as part of the public tour. It is the kind of resolution that satisfied no one entirely and that everyone involved found ways to manage. In 1994, the Papandreou government moved against the family's remaining position more directly. It stripped Constantine of his Greek citizenship and revoked his passport. The government's argument was that Constantine had never formally accepted the republic, had continued to use the royal title, and had thereby placed himself outside the community of Greek citizens by his own choices. The legislation that accompanied the citizenship decision confiscated the remaining royal properties outright. Tatoi, the large forested estate north of Athens that had been the royal family's principal residence outside the capital, and Monarchy on Corfu, with no compensation and no provision for continued family access. Tatoi was more than a real estate matter. The estate covered many thousands of acres of wooded hillside above the plain of Attica and contained the royal family's private cemetery. Paul I was buried there. Queen Frederica, who had died in Madrid in February of 1981, at the age of 63, had been reinterred there after negotiations with the Greek government over access and arrangements. The graves of earlier members of the dynasty were there as well. Tatoi was where the Greek royal family buried its dead, and the confiscation meant that reaching those graves required a formal request to the state that had taken the land rather than access to land the family still held. Constantine pursued the property dispute through the European Court of Human Rights. The court found in his favor. Greece was required to pay compensation. The settlement was considerably less than the assessed value of what had been taken, and came in monetary payment, rather than any return of the properties. The Greek government was not prepared to hand back Tatoi. It was, however, required under the court's ruling to pay for it, which established in law a principle that the political argument alone had not produced. The citizenship question found its resolution, after a fashion, in 2002. Constantine was issued a Greek passport as a private citizen, in the name of Constantine Glücksburg, without title and without any dynastic designation. The name on the document was one the Greek royal family had not used officially in generations. He accepted it. He wanted to come home, and this was the form in which home was available. Began returning to Greece more frequently in the years that followed, maintaining a private apartment in Athens, attending church services, visiting Tatoi, existing in the city in the way a former king exists when the country has decided to acknowledge his presence without acknowledging what that presence once signified. It required discretion on both sides, and both sides managed it. The family he had raised in London had scattered across the European world. His eldest son Pavlos, known internationally as Paul, had married Marie Chantal Miller in England in July of 1995. The ceremony drew a significant number of European royal family members who attended as relatives and personal friends. Marie Chantal's father was an American-born businessman who had built his fortune in retail across Asia, and she had grown up internationally in a way that matched the trajectory of the family she was marrying into. Their 5 children, Maria Olympia, Constantine Alexios, Achilleas Andreas, Odysseus Kimon, and Aristides Stavros, carry names drawn from both the Greek heroic tradition and the dynastic record, and they have grown up across several countries simultaneously, citizens of a world that their grandfather had arrived at by circumstance rather than design. Maria Olympia has pursued a career in fashion and modeling. Constantine Alexios pursued military service. The 3 younger children are growing up in a world where the family's decades of exile are history rather than lived memory. Princess Alexia, Constantine's eldest daughter, settled in Spain, in the same country where her aunt Sophia was queen. Prince Nikolaus married Tatiana Blatnik, a woman of Slovenian heritage, in a ceremony on the island of Spetses in 2010. Prince Philippos, the youngest, born in London in 1986, has built his own life internationally. The exile the family inhabited for over 50 years shaped them in ways that are legible in the generation that follows. None of Constantine's 5 children grew up inside Greece as their primary country. All of them are Greek in name and family identification, and none of them are Greek in the straightforward sense of having been formed by the Greek state. That condition, carrying the identity of a country you were not raised within, is not unique to the Greek royal family. It is the common inheritance of dynasties that lost their positions during the upheavals of the 20th century. What makes the Greek case distinctive is that the country that abolished the monarchy has remained a stable democracy, the family has remained alive and present, and the two have had to find ways to coexist across more than 50 years without either resolution or rupture. Constantine II had grown up training for a specific role in a specific country and spent the majority of his adult life managing the aftermath of losing it. His children grew up with no such prior position to lose. They were formed by international schools and European capitals and the particular social world of a family that was royal in name and historical identity without being royal in any operational sense. That difference runs through everything the family became across the exile decades. Queen Frederica's story deserves its own moment. She had been a polarizing presence throughout her time as queen, energetic, politically engaged in ways that critics found inappropriate for a constitutional consort, and deeply involved in the charitable work she had championed during and after the Civil War. Greek politicians across the spectrum had found her interventionist, and the Republican case had often pointed to her as evidence that the palace had exceeded its proper limits. She left Greece on the aircraft from Kalamata alongside her son in December of 1967 and never returned permanently. She died in Madrid in February of 1981 at the home of her daughter Sophia, surrounded by family. The arrangements to bury her at Tatoi required negotiations with the Greek government, and the funeral was conducted under close official attention. She was laid beside her husband in the royal cemetery within the estate that the Greek state already administered and would formally confiscate 13 years later. The estate she was buried in had its own subsequent history. Tatoi had been variably maintained across the Greek governments that held it after the confiscation of 1994. Some administrations had done more with it than others, and none had done enough. In August of 2021, wildfires swept through the hills north of Athens, in what became one of the most destructive fire seasons in modern Greek history. The fires reached the edges of Tatoi. Outbuildings burned. The main house and the royal cemetery survived, but images of firefighting aircraft working the ridgelines above the graves circulated widely during the emergency and drew attention to how poorly the state had maintained what it had taken. The fires exposed the gap between the legal weight of the confiscation and the practical indifference that had followed it for nearly 3 decades. Constantine was in Athens when the fires burned near Tatoi. He was in his 80s by then, managing the accumulated health challenges of age, present in the city as a private citizen, under the arrangements settled over the previous 2 decades. He was recognizable enough to be visible, quiet enough to exist without provoking the political arguments his presence might have triggered at an earlier moment. Greece had been a republic for nearly 50 years. The constitutional question settled in 1974 had not been seriously reopened. Opinion polls across the intervening decades had shown varying levels of residual sympathy for the monarchy among Greek voters, occasionally rising to levels that surprised observers, but never in combination with any political force willing to make restoration an actual electoral proposition. The Greek state's posture in Constantine's final years was one of correct neutrality. He was a private citizen. He was in his 80s. He was not a problem. He died in a private clinic in Athens on the 10th of January 2023. He was 82. Anne-Marie and their children were with him. The Greek president and prime minister issued carefully worded statements of condolence, acknowledging the death without conferring any posthumous official status on the man who had died. There was no state funeral. A private ceremony was held, attended by members of European royal families who came as relatives. His coffin was draped in the Greek royal standard, a flag that carries no official standing in the Greek Republic, and was taken to Tatoi, where he was buried in the royal cemetery beside Paul I and Frederica. The burial completed something that had been suspended since the night of December 14, 1967. He had left Greece as king and returned to it under a different name, had taken Greece to a European court over the ground he was eventually buried in, and had lived long enough to watch the fires that threatened that ground and to die in the city those fires had not reached. He was buried where his family had always been buried, on terms the Republic had established rather than the family. What the monarchy had been, and what it had failed to be, are questions Greek historians have been answering in different ways for decades, and the argument has not settled. Constantine's compliance with the junta in April of 1967, his months of accommodation with the regime before the counter-coup itself and its failure, each of these continues to generate serious historical debate. What can be said with precision is that the 69% who voted against the monarchy in December of 1974 were voting on a record they had lived through. The result was not the product of ignorance, it was a judgment. Constantine's own relationship to that judgment, expressed through the legal challenges, the eventual acceptance of a private citizen's passport, the return to Athens on the terms that were available, and the decision to die there rather than abroad, reflects a man who understood what the verdict meant even when he disagreed with it. The Greek government that accepted the arrangement did so without endorsing what he had represented. Both sides understood the terms. The arrangement was not elegant, but it was what the decades had produced, and it lasted. The family he left behind extends across the geography of contemporary Europe. Pavlos and Marie Chantal have raised 5 children with Greek names in countries their great-grandparents never governed. Tatoi remains in Greek state ownership and has been the subject of recurring government discussions about restoration and development, none of which have yet produced a settled plan. Mon Repose on Corfu is a museum. The dynasty that Greece imported from Denmark and eventually voted away is still present, in the form that exile and time and democratic referendum have made it, bearing Greek names in European capitals, visiting graves in an estate the state owns, carrying the history of an institution that lasted just over a century in a country that decided, by a considerable majority, that it had served its purpose. That is not tragedy. It is not triumph either. It is what happens when a monarchy loses not to an invading army or a revolutionary mob, but to a vote, held on a December afternoon, by people who had lived through enough to form an opinion about the institution and the man who had led it. The 69% left very little to argue with. The family has spent the decades since working out how to live inside the answer they gave. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.